Canadian dairy farmers worry that the Trump administration has Canada's supply management system in its crosshairs. A Quebec farmer says that without supply management, the U.S. dairy industry could flood the country in a minute. He says U.S. producers have advantages in the form of cheaper labor, often in the form of undocumented immigrants. The Canada-U.S.-Mexico free trade deal is scheduled for review next year. Our news director, David Clement, has more on why Canada's dairy farmers are concerned.
Thank you for that, Theresa. It's really important to note here that the dairy farmers are not necessarily concerned with Trump's announcement of reciprocal tariffs on Canada's dairy industry. So President Trump has said he wants to increase tariffs on Canadian dairy to match what Canada has, which is in and around the range of 250%. Now, that's not flat across the board. It is complicated, but generally speaking, that is true. So Canadian dairy farmers are not necessarily concerned about that tariff from the Trump administration because the Canadian market does not provide milk for the U.S. market because supply management is a program that really insulates the industry so that its sole purpose is to provide the Canadian market with milk. Now, what they are concerned about is if the Trump administration is going to want the Canadian government to make concessions on supply management in the lead up to the renegotiation of the USMCA. So, quick reminder here for folks who don't know, supply management is a system of quotas and tariffs, quotas meaning permission to produce a product, and tariffs to limit international competition. So if Canada were to make concessions on supply management in those negotiations with the Trump administration, what that would mean is that Canadian dairy farmers would have to compete with dairy farmers in the United States in terms of the milk on grocery store shelves in Canada. So their concerns are that if we remove supply management, they're going to have to compete with U.S. product. U.S. product is often anywhere from 20 to 30% cheaper depending on the year. That fluctuates. In Canada, the price of milk is more stable than in the United States. But in the United States, despite the volatility, it is on average around 20 to 30% cheaper depending on the year. So they're worried they're going to have to compete on price. And that would be their concern in terms of supply management. However, it is important to note that there is research that suggests that getting rid of supply management would not actually be a net negative for the Canadian dairy industry. And so the reason why it could be explained in that way is that supply management limits our farmers' ability to export their goods abroad. And so right now, Canada does not really export a lot of anything that's supply managed: milk, chicken, eggs, cheese, etc. If we were to ease up on the restrictions regarding supply management, or even get rid of it, if that was something that the Trump administration was advocating for, we could see an opportunity where there would be export opportunities for dairy farmers that never existed before. And it's important to note that the demand for things like milk, as the global middle class has grown, demand for milk has significantly increased. And there is a case study from New Zealand where they had their own system of supply management and ended up getting rid of it and have become a large player in the export market for milk. And so that case study is in 1983. They got rid of supply management in their dairy sector. At the time, they exported around $4.3 billion in milk. Come to 2023, so 3 decades later, it's skyrocketed to $43.4 billion in exports. And so New Zealand, for those who argue against supply management, is a case study of where getting rid of these rules allows for domestic producers to become exporters. And rather than serving a market of 40 million in Canada, they can compete on the global stage. And so The concerns about supply management, yes, the dairy farmers would have to compete with U.S. product if the Trump administration is looking for concessions, but there may be opportunities for them, if that happens, to enter the export market like has happened with New Zealand farmers.